dust from the cattle drive still clung to Jake Morrison's weathered boots as he walked through the bustling streets of Dry Creek Town. After 3 months on the trail, the small frontier settlement felt like a grand city to him. The year was 1887, and the American West was still wild and unforgiving. Jake had earned good money from the drive, enough to last him through the winter if he was careful. At 32, Jake was a man shaped by the harsh realities of frontier life. His face bore the marks of countless days under the scorching sun, and his hands were calloused from years of handling rope and reins. He was a quiet man, preferring the company of horses and cattle to most people. The loneliness of the trail suited him, or so he told himself. As he made his way to the saloon for a well-deserved drink, commotion erupted from the town square. A crowd had gathered around a makeshift platform where a thin, sharp-faced man in a dirty suit was conducting what appeared to be an auction. Jake's curiosity got the better of him, and he pushed through the crowd to get a closer look. What he saw made his blood run cold. Standing on the platform was a young woman, barely more than a girl, with hollow cheeks and frightened eyes. Her dress was little more than rags, and she clutched a tattered shawl around her thin shoulders. The auctioneer was treating her like livestock, pointing out her supposed qualities to the jeering crowd. "Now here's a fine specimen, gentlemen," the auctioneer called out with a cruel smile. "Young, healthy, and ready to work. Perfect for any man needing a wife or housekeeper. What am I bid?" Jake felt sick to his stomach. He knew that debt, slavery, and forced marriages were unfortunately common in these lawless times. But seeing it firsthand was different. The girl couldn't have been more than 19, with long auburn hair that caught the afternoon light despite its unkempt state. Her green eyes darted around the crowd like a trapped animal looking for escape. "I'll start the bidding at $1, the auctioneer announced. A grubby prospector raised his hand. $1, I hear, $1. Do I hear 2? A rancher with tobacco-stained teeth nodded. $2! Jake watched in horror as the bidding continued. These men weren't looking for a wife, they were looking for someone they could exploit and abuse. The girl's eyes filled with tears, but she stood straight, maintaining what dignity she could in this degrading situation. $2 going once, going twice, the auctioneer began. Something inside Jake snapped. Without thinking, he stepped forward and shouted, $10! The crowd fell silent and turned to stare at the tall cowboy. Even the auctioneer seemed surprised by the sudden jump in bidding. "Did I hear $10? The man asked, his eyes lighting up with greed. "You heard right," Jake said firmly, pulling out his money. $10 cash. The other bidders grumbled but didn't challenge the amount. $10 was more than most of them made in a week. The auctioneer grinned widely and banged his gavel. "Sold to the cowboy for $10. Jake pushed through the crowd and climbed onto the platform. Up close, he could see that the girl was trembling. Whether from fear or cold, he couldn't tell. Her green eyes met his, and he saw intelligence there, along with the fear. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Sarah Collins." "Well, Sarah Collins, I'm Jake Morrison, and you're safe now." The auctioneer held out his hand for payment, but his expression had turned suspicious. "You planning to collect your property, cowboy?" Jake handed over the money while keeping his eyes on Sarah. "She's not property. She's a person." After completing the transaction, Jake helped Sarah down from the platform. The crowd began to disperse, disappointed that the entertainment was over. As they walked away from the square, Sarah finally spoke. "Why did you do that?" she asked, still not quite believing what had happened. Jake was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "Because it was the right thing to do," he finally said. "Nobody should be sold like cattle." Sarah looked up at him with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. "What happens to me now?" "That's up to you," Jake replied. "You're free to go wherever you want." Sarah stopped walking and stared at him. "Free! Free!" Jake confirmed. "I didn't buy you to own you, Sarah. I bought you to set you free." Tears began to flow down Sarah's cheeks, and for the first time since Jake had seen her, they weren't tears of fear or despair. They were tears of relief and hope. "But I have nowhere to go," she said softly. "No family, no money, nothing." Jake considered this. He had been planning to winter in town, maybe find work at one of the local ranches, but looking at this young woman who had just been through such an ordeal, he couldn't just walk away. "I've got a room at the boarding house," he said. "It's not much, but it's clean and safe. You can stay there tonight, and tomorrow we'll figure something out." Sarah looked at him with wonder. You'd do that for a stranger? We all need help sometimes, Jake said simply. As they walked toward the boarding house, Sarah began to tell her story. She had been orphaned 2 years earlier when cholera swept through her hometown. With no relatives and no money, she had been taken in by a man who promised to find her honest work. Instead, he had sold her to a traveling merchant who brought her to frontier towns to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. I've been sold 3 times before, she said quietly. Each time was worse than the last. Jake felt his anger rising, but he kept his voice calm. That's behind you now. No one will ever sell you again. The boarding house was run by Mrs. Henderson, a kindly widow who took one look at Sarah and immediately ushered her inside. After explaining the situation, Mrs. Henderson agreed to let Sarah share Jake's room, with a makeshift partition for privacy. That evening, as they sat in the boarding house dining room sharing a simple meal, Jake found himself studying Sarah more closely. Despite everything she had been through, there was a strength about her that impressed him. She ate slowly, savoring each bite as if she couldn't quite believe the food was real. This is the best meal I've had in months, she said gratefully. Henderson is a fine cook, Jake agreed. Sarah, can you read and write? She nodded. My mother taught me before she died. Why? Just wondering what kind of work you might be able to find. This town could use a schoolteacher, and there's talk of starting a newspaper. Sarah's eyes lit up. I loved to read when I was younger. We had some books at home before, she trailed off. Before what? Before everything fell apart, she finished sadly. Jake reached across the table and gently touched her hand. Sometimes when everything falls apart, it's just making room for something better. Sarah looked into his kind brown eyes and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Here was a man who had rescued her from a terrible fate and asked for nothing in return. It seemed too good to be true. Why are you being so kind to me? She asked. You don't even know me. Jake was quiet for a long moment. I guess I know what it's like to be alone, he said finally. I've been riding the trails by myself for 10 years now. Sometimes a man gets tired of his own company. That night, as Sarah lay on her small cot behind the makeshift partition, she stared at the ceiling and wondered if this was all a dream. For the first time in 2 years, she felt safe. She could hear Jake's steady breathing from the other side of the room, and somehow that sound was more comforting than any lullaby. Jake, for his part, lay awake thinking about the strange turn his life had taken. He had come to town planning to drink away his loneliness and maybe find some temporary companionship. Instead, he had rescued a young woman from a fate worse than death. He didn't regret it, but he wondered what would happen next. The next morning brought new challenges. Word had spread quickly through the small town about the cowboy who had paid top dollar for the auctioned girl, and there were plenty of people with opinions about it. Some admired Jake's gallantry, while others whispered that he must have had ulterior motives. Jake was having coffee in the dining room when Tom Bradley, the town's self-appointed moral authority, approached their table. Bradley owned the general store and considered himself a pillar of the community. Morrison, Bradley said, his voice dripping with disapproval. Folks are talking about what you did yesterday. Let them talk, Jake replied calmly, not looking up from his coffee. It ain't right, a single man keeping a young woman like that. People are starting to wonder about your intentions. Jake's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. My intentions are my own business, Bradley, not when it affects the moral fabric of our community, Bradley continued. If you're going to keep that girl, you need to do right by her.
Make it legal.
Sarah, who had been quietly eating her breakfast, looked up sharply.
I'm not that girl.
Bradley. I have a name, and I can speak for myself. Bradley looked surprised by her boldness. Well, that is, Mr. Morrison saved my life, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. He's shown me nothing but kindness and respect. If there's anything improper about this situation, it's people making assumptions about things they don't understand. Jake looked at Sarah with admiration. Despite everything she had been through, she had fire in her spirit. Bradley, clearly uncomfortable with being challenged by a woman, muttered something under his breath and walked away. Thank you, Jake said quietly. You didn't need to defend me. Yes, I did, Sarah replied firmly. You stood up for me when I couldn't stand up for myself. The least I can do is return the favor. As the days passed, Jake and Sarah fell into a comfortable routine. Jake found work at a nearby ranch, while Sarah helped Mrs. Henderson with the boarding house chores in exchange for their room and board. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and talk about their lives, their dreams, and their fears. Jake learnt that Sarah was more educated than most people in town. She'd read extensively before her parents died, and she had a quick mind for figures and business. Sarah discovered that despite his rough exterior, Jake was a gentle soul who had chosen the lonely life of a cowboy after being betrayed by someone he had trusted. "I was engaged once," Jake admitted one evening as they watched the sunset. "Her name was Elizabeth. She was the daughter of a rancher back in Texas. We were supposed to be married, but she ran off with a traveling salesman the week before the wedding." "I'm sorry," Sarah said softly. "That must have been devastating." Jake shrugged. "It taught me not to trust too easily. I figured it was better to be alone than to risk that kind of hurt again." "Loneliness is its own kind of hurt," Sarah observed. Jake looked at her with surprise. For someone so young, she had remarkable insight into human nature. As autumn turned to winter, the relationship between Jake and Sarah deepened, from friendship into something more profound. They never spoke of it directly, but there was a growing tenderness between them that couldn't be ignored. Jake found himself looking forward to coming home to Sarah each evening, while Sarah began to think of Jake not as her rescuer, but as the man she was falling in love with. The turning point came on a cold December evening, when word reached town that a band of outlaws was heading their way. The sheriff was organizing a group of men to defend the town, and Jake immediately volunteered. "I don't want you to go," Sarah said as Jake prepared his rifle. "I have to," Jake replied. "It's my duty to help protect the town. But what if something happens to you?" Sarah's voice was filled with emotion. Jake stopped what he was doing and looked at her. "Would it matter to you if something happened to me?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Of course it would matter. Jake, I love you." The words hung in the air between them. Jake set down his rifle and crossed the room to take Sarah in his arms. "I love you too, Sarah. I think I have since the day I first saw you." They held each other tightly, both knowing that this moment would change everything between them. When the outlaws were finally driven off without a fight, Jake returned to find Sarah waiting for him with a mixture of relief and joy that told him everything he needed to know about their future together. The winter of 1887 was harsh, but Jake and Sarah found warmth in each other's company. Their love had blossomed naturally, growing from mutual respect and genuine affection. However, the reality of their situation was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The whispers and stares from townspeople grew more pointed with each passing day. Mrs. Henderson, who had grown fond of both Jake and Sarah, finally addressed the elephant in the room one snowy evening in January. "You two need to get married," she said bluntly as they sat around her kitchen table. "I don't care what your feelings are on the matter, but this town won't stand for unmarried folks living together much longer." Jake and Sarah exchanged glances. They had talked about marriage in private, but both were hesitant for different reasons. Jake worried that Sarah might feel obligated to marry him out of gratitude rather than love, while Sarah feared that Jake might see marriage as a burden he had taken on rather than a choice he wanted to make. "Mrs. Henderson," Sarah began carefully, "we understand your concern, but—" "But nothing," the older woman interrupted. "I've watched you two these past months. You love each other, plain as day. Don't let pride or fear keep you from happiness." That night, Jake asked Sarah to take a walk with him despite the cold. They bundled up in their heavy coats and walked to the edge of town, where they could see the stars clearly in the winter sky. "Sarah," Jake began, his breath visible in the frigid air, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." Sarah's heart began to race, sensing what was coming. "Do you want to marry me because you love me or because you feel like you owe me something?" Sarah stopped walking and turned to face him. "Jake Morrison, how can you ask me that? After everything we've shared, after all the conversations we've had, how can you think I would marry anyone out of obligation?" Jake looked down at his boots. "I guess I'm scared that you'll wake up one day and realize you could do better than a broken-down cowboy who's got nothing to offer but a strong back and willing heart." Sarah reached up and cupped his face in her gloved hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You saved my life, yes. But more than that, you've given me a reason to live. You've shown me what love really means. I don't want to marry you because I owe you. I want to marry you because I can't imagine living without you." Jake's eyes searched her face, looking for any sign of doubt. Finding none, he pulled her close and kissed her gently. "Then will you marry me, Sarah Collins?" Will you be my wife? Yes, Sarah whispered against his lips. Yes, I'll marry you. They were wed the following week, in a simple ceremony at the town church. Mrs. Henderson stood as Sarah's witness, while Jake's friend Tom Miller from the ranch served as his best man. Sarah wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Belt Henderson had helped her alter from one of her own gowns. It wasn't the fancy wedding either of them might have dreamed of, but it was perfect for them. The reverend who performed the ceremony spoke about the unusual circumstances that had brought them together, calling it an example of God working in mysterious ways. Sometimes, he said, what appears to be a tragedy is actually the beginning of a miracle. After the ceremony, the newlyweds moved to a small cabin on the outskirts of town that Jake had rented with his savings. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms and a small kitchen, but it was theirs. Sarah had never owned anything before, and the simple joy of having her own home brought tears to her eyes. It's perfect, she said as Jake carried her over the threshold. It's not much, Jake replied, looking around at the sparse furnishings. It's ours, Sarah said simply, and that made all the difference. Their first months of marriage were blissful. Jake continued working at the ranch, while Sarah took in sewing and washing to contribute to their income. They were building a life together slowly but surely. Sarah's natural intelligence and Jake's practical skills complemented each other perfectly. However, their happiness was tested when spring brought unwelcome visitors to Dry Creek. A group of men rode into town claiming to be debt collectors, and they were looking for Sarah. Jake was at work when they arrived, but Mrs. Henderson sent word immediately. By the time Jake reached town, the men had already questioned several people about Sarah's whereabouts. The leader of the group was a tall, thin man with cold grey eyes and a cruel mouth. He introduced himself as Marcus Crane, and he claimed that Sarah owed money to his employer. The girl was sold to pay off debts, Crane explained to the gathering crowd. But she ran off before fulfilling her obligations. We're here to collect what's owed. Jake pushed through the crowd, his face dark with anger. Sarah didn't run off. I bought her fair and square. I have the papers to prove it. Crane looked Jake up and down with obvious disdain. You bought her, Cowboy? For how much? $10, Jake replied proudly. Crane laughed, a harsh sound that made several people in the crowd uncomfortable. $10? Friend, that girl owes my employer $50 in debts. Your purchase ain't worth the paper it's written on. Jake felt his world starting to crumble. That's impossible. The auction was legal. The auction was a scam, Crane replied coldly. The man who sold her to you had no right to do so. She belongs to us until her debts are paid. At that moment, Sarah appeared at Jake's side. She had heard the commotion and come running from their cabin. When she saw Crane, her face went white with terror. No, she whispered. Not again. Crane smiled when he saw her. There's our little runaway. Time to come home, Sarah. She is home, Jake said firmly, putting his arm protectively around his wife. She's my wife now. Whatever debts you claim she owes are paid. With what? Crane sneered. You got $50, Cowboy? Jake's heart sank. $50 was more money than he made in 2 months. Even if he sold everything they owned, he couldn't raise that kind of money quickly. I thought not. Crane continued. Don't worry, we'll take good care of her. She's valuable property. I'm not property, Sarah said, finding her voice. I'm a married woman. I have rights. Crane laughed again. You got rights when you pay your debts, girl. Until then, you belong to whoever owns your contract. The crowd was growing restless, with some people supporting Jake and Sarah, while others seemed to think Crane had a legitimate claim. The sheriff, a weak man named Potter, who was more politician than lawman, seemed inclined to side with whoever could cause him the least trouble. Now see here, Potter said nervously. This is a complicated legal matter. Maybe we should. Ain't nothing complicated about it, Crane interrupted. We got papers. Legal papers that say this girl owes money. Until that debt is paid, she comes with us. Jake looked around desperately. He could see sympathy in some faces, but he also saw the fear that came with confronting armed men who claimed legal authority. In the frontier, might often made right, and Crane's group was better armed than the townspeople. Give me time, Jake said finally. Give me time to raise the money. Crane considered this. How much time? A month, Jake replied, though he had no idea how he could possibly raise $50 in that time. 2 weeks, Crane counted. We'll be back in 2 weeks. If you don't have the money then, the girl comes with us. After Crane and his men rode out of town, Jake and Sarah walked home in stunned silence. The joy and security they had built over the winter suddenly seemed as fragile as a soap bubble. "We'll find a way," Jake said as they sat in their small kitchen. "Somehow, we'll find the money." Sarah took his hands in hers. "Jake, $50 is impossible. Even if you worked for years, we couldn't save that much." "Then I'll borrow it," Jake said desperately. "From who?" "No one in this town has that kind of money to lend." Jake stood up and began pacing. "I could sell my horse, my saddle, everything we own. And what would that get us? Maybe $20 if we're lucky." The hopelessness of their situation began to sink in. Jake had rescued Sarah once, but this time the odds seemed insurmountable. $50 might as well have been 50,000. That evening, as they lay in bed holding each other, Sarah spoke into the darkness. "Jake, what if I just went with them?" "Don't even say that," Jake replied fiercely. "But if I don't, they'll probably come back with more men, maybe hurt people in town. I couldn't live with that." "And I couldn't live with letting them take you," Jake said. "We'll figure something out. We have to." The next few days were agony. Jake tried everything he could think of to raise money. He sold his extra saddle, his rifle, and even some of Sarah's jewelry that Mrs. Arsenara Henderson had given her as a wedding gift. But he could only raise $15, nowhere near what they needed. Meanwhile, word of their predicament had spread throughout the town. Some people offered small donations, but most were struggling themselves. The harsh reality of frontier life was that $50 was a fortune to most people. On the 10th day, Jake was working at the ranch when Tom Miller approached him with a serious expression. "Jake, I've been thinking about your situation," Tom said. "I might know a way to raise the money, but you're not going to like it." Jake looked up from the fence he was mending. "I'm listening." "There's going to be a high-stakes poker game at the Silver Dollar Saloon tomorrow night. Some wealthy ranchers and businessmen from the territory are coming to town. Word is there'll be thousands of dollars on the table." Jake shook his head. "Tom, I'm not a gambler, and even if I was, I'd need money to get into a game like that." "I've been thinking about that too," Tom said. "I could lend you what you need to buy in. $25. $25? Jake was stunned. "Tom, I can't take that kind of money from you. You're not taking it. You're borrowing it. And if you win, you pay me back and keep the rest. If you lose..." Tom shrugged. "Well, Sarah gets taken away anyway. Why would you risk that much money for us?" Tom was quiet for a moment. "Because what you did for that girl was the most decent thing I've ever seen, and because everybody deserves a chance at happiness." That night, Jake told Sarah about Tom's offer. She was torn between hope and terror. "Jake, you've never played poker for serious money before. What if you lose everything?"
Then we're no worse off than we are now, Jake replied. "Sarah, this might be our only chance."
Sarah looked into her husband's eyes and saw the determination there. She knew that he would rather die fighting than give up without trying. "All right," she said finally, "but promise me something. If you lose, if they take me away, promise you won't do anything foolish trying to get me back." Jake started to protest, but Sarah cut him off. "Promise me, Jake. I couldn't bear it if something happened to you because of me." Reluctantly, Jake promised, though he had no intention of keeping that promise if it came to that. The next evening, Jake put on his best clothes and walked to the Silver Dollar Saloon. The game was already in progress when he arrived, and the atmosphere was tense with concentration and the smell of tobacco and whiskey. The players were exactly what Tom had described. Wealthy men who could afford to lose more money than most people saw in a lifetime. Jake took his seat at the table with his $25, knowing that he was completely outclassed. As the cards were dealt, Jake said a silent prayer for luck and thought of Sarah waiting at home. Everything they had built together, everything they hoped for in the future, would be decided by the turn of a card. The poker table at the Silver Dollar Saloon was bathed in the yellow glow of oil lamps, casting long shadows across the faces of the 6 players seated around it. Jake Morrison sat with his modest stake of $25, feeling completely out of place among the wealthy ranchers and businessmen who were treating hundreds of dollars like pocket change. To his left sat Colonel William Hartley, a cattle baron from the next territory who owned thousands of head of livestock. Across from him was Marcus Webb, a railroad investor with interests throughout the West. The other players were equally impressive in their wealth and status, making Jake feel like a minnow swimming with sharks. The first few hands were cautious affairs, with Jake folding rather than risk his limited funds on uncertain cards. He watched the other players carefully, studying their habits and tells. Colonel Hartley had a tendency to stroke his mustache when he was bluffing, while Webb's left eye twitched slightly when he had a strong hand. As the evening wore on, Jake managed to win a few small pots, gradually increasing his stake to $35. But he knew that to win the $50 he needed, he would have to take serious risks. The other players had begun to notice his conservative play, and Webb made a comment about the careful cowboy that drew chuckles from around the table. The turning point came during the ninth hand of the evening. Jake was dealt a pair of kings, a strong starting hand that gave him hope. The betting opened conservatively, but as each player called or raised, the pot grew larger. By the time it came back to Jake, there was already $40 in the center of the table. Webb raised the bet to $10, a significant amount that forced two other players to fold. Jake studied his cards again, knowing that this might be his best chance. With a deep breath, he called the bet. Colonel Hartley raised again, bringing the pot to $70. Webb called, and now it was Jake's turn. He could fold and preserve most of his stake, or he could raise and risk everything on this hand. Thinking of Sarah waiting at home, Jake pushed his remaining chips forward. I raised $20. The silence around the table was deafening. Webb studied Jake's face intently, looking for any sign of weakness or bluff. After what felt like an eternity, he folded his cards. Colonel Hartley, however, smiled grimly and called the raise. When the cards were revealed, Jake's pair of kings beat the Colonel's pair of jacks. The pot of $90 was pushed toward Jake, and for the first time since entering the saloon, he felt like he might actually have a chance. But his celebration was short-lived. Marcus Webb, clearly annoyed at being outplayed by someone he considered beneath him, began raising the stakes aggressively in subsequent hands. Jake knew that the railroad investor was trying to force him out of the game before he could consolidate his winnings. The strategy almost worked. Over the next hour, Jake found himself holding mediocre hands while the betting became increasingly fierce. He was forced to fold hand after hand, watching his stack slowly diminish as he paid the antes and small bets necessary to stay in the game. By midnight, Jake was down to $65, still ahead of where he started, but not enough to pay Sarah's debt. Worse, the game was beginning to wind down as some of the players prepared to leave town in the morning. Then came the hand that would determine everything. Jake was dealt an ace and a king of spades, giving him the potential for a very strong hand. The flop revealed the queen of spades, jack of spades, and 10 of hearts. Jake had made a straight and was drawing to a royal flush, the best possible hand in poker. Webb opened the betting aggressively, pushing $20 into the pot. One by one, the other players called. When it reached Jake, he knew this was his moment. He called the bet, leaving him with just enough money for one more round of betting. The fourth card was revealed, the 9 of spades. Jake now had an ace-high straight and was one card away from a royal flush. The betting resumed with even more intensity. Colonel Hartley pushed $30 into the center, and Webb immediately raised it to $50. The other players folded, unable to match such aggressive betting. Jake stared at the cards, calculating his odds. Even if the final card didn't give him the royal flush, his straight was likely to be the winning hand, but calling this bet would put him all in, risking everything on a single turn of a card. Around the table, the other players watched silently. They had all heard about Jake's situation with his wife, and despite their competitive nature, there was a grudging respect for a man willing to risk everything for love. Jake looked at his cards one more time, then at the pile of money in the center of the table. There was over $200 there, more than enough to pay Sarah's debt and secure their future together. With a steady hand, he pushed his remaining chips forward. "I'm all in." Webb smiled coldly. "Call." The dealer revealed the final card, the King of Diamonds. Jake's straight held up, but more importantly, the pot contained enough money to solve all their problems. As the chips were pushed toward him, Jake felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. He had actually done it. He had won enough money to save Sarah and give them a real chance at building a life together. Webb, clearly frustrated at losing such a large pot to someone he considered an amateur, made one final attempt to intimidate Jake. "Beginner's luck, cowboy. You'd better quit while you're ahead." Jake looked the railroad investor in the eye as he stacked his winnings. "Mr. Webb, I came here for a specific purpose, and I've accomplished it. I have no intention of risking my wife's freedom on another hand." The next morning, Jake returned home to find Sarah pacing anxiously in their small cabin. When she saw him enter with a large bag of money, she nearly collapsed with relief. "You did it," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You actually did it." "We did it," Jake corrected, pulling her into his arms. "We're in this together, remember?" 2 days later, Crane and his men returned to Dry Creek as promised. Jake was waiting for them in the town square with a full $50 and several witnesses, including the sheriff and Tom Miller. When Crane saw the money, his expression shifted from confidence to disappointment. "You actually raised it," he said with surprise. "Every penny," Jake replied. With interest. He handed over $55, 5 more than required. "Now I want papers showing that my wife's debt is paid in full." Crane reluctantly produced a document stating that Sarah Collins Morrison's debt was satisfied and that she was free from any further obligation. Jake examined the papers carefully before accepting them. "If I ever see you or your men near my wife again," Jake said quietly, "it won't go well for you." Crane pocketed the money and remounted his horse. "Enjoy your freedom, girl. You paid dearly enough for it." As the debt collectors rode out of town, Sarah and Jake stood hand in hand, finally free from the shadow that had threatened their happiness. The townspeople who had gathered to witness the confrontation broke into spontaneous applause. Mrs. Henderson, who had become like a mother to Sarah, hugged her tightly. "I never doubted you two would find a way," she said with tears in her eyes. With their newfound financial security, Jake and Sarah were able to make significant improvements to their life. Jake used part of his poker winnings to buy a small piece of land outside town, where he began raising cattle with Tom Miller as his partner. Sarah started a small school for the local children, fulfilling her dream of teaching and contributing to the community. Their first anniversary was celebrated not just by themselves, but by the entire town of Dry Creek. What had begun as a scandalous situation had transformed into an inspiring love story that gave hope to everyone who knew them. As they danced together at the community celebration, Sarah looked up at her husband with eyes full of love and gratitude. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Spending that $10 on a stranger?" Jake spun her around gently before pulling her close again. "Sarah Morrison, that was the best investment I ever made. I thought I was saving you, but you saved me too." "How did I save you?" "You taught me that taking a chance on love is always worth the risk. Before I met you, I was just existing. Now I'm truly living." As the evening wore on and the celebration continued around them, Jake and Sarah stood on the porch of the town hall, looking up at the stars. In the distance, they could see their small ranch house, where they had built a life based on love, trust, and mutual respect. "What are you thinking about?" Sarah asked, noticing Jake's contemplative expression. "I was thinking about that day in the town square," he replied. "When I saw you standing on that platform, I knew I couldn't walk away. Something inside me said that our paths were meant to cross." Sarah leaned against his shoulder. "I was so frightened that day. I thought my life was over. I never imagined that the worst day of my life would lead to the best thing that ever happened to me." "And what was that?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. "Finding you," Sarah said simply. "Finding home." Years later, Jake and Sarah would tell their story to their children and grandchildren, always emphasizing the importance of standing up for what's right and never giving up on love. Their ranch became one of the most successful in the territory, and Sarah's school produced some of the most educated children in the region. But more than their material success, Jake and Sarah Morrison became symbols of hope for anyone who believed that true love could overcome any obstacle. They proved that sometimes the most unlikely circumstances can lead to the most beautiful outcomes. The people of Dry Creek would remember them as the couple who showed that love isn't about what someone is worth in dollars and cents, but about the priceless value of human dignity and the courage to fight for it. In the end, Sarah Collins, who had once been valued at only $2, had found something worth infinitely more than money. A man who saw her true worth and was willing to risk everything to protect it. And Jake Morrison, the lonely cowboy who had spent years avoiding emotional entanglements, discovered that opening his heart to love was the greatest adventure he would ever undertake. Their love story became a testament to the power of compassion, the strength of commitment, and the belief that every person deserves to be valued for who they truly are, not for what others might try to make them worth.